Dark of the Moon is, in my opinion, the lowest point for the Transformers live-action movies. I say that having never seen The Last Night, and I do not intend to because I already know I will not enjoy it. I was extremely excited for this movie because of all the trailers really hyping it up, and I was so immersed into Transformers Online fan content that I was constantly being stimulated with other people excited about the film, only to be disappointed when it finally released. I never had a chance to see it in theaters, but quickly after it released in theaters, there was a absolute avalanche of online reviews and opinions of other content creators online
I knew it wasn't going to be fucking good. I was more pissed off at this one than I was at the second one.
saying how it was disappointing, overly long, it had this awful dark gray color palette to the whole thing, and Shia LaBeouf's character was the worst that he's ever been. His most annoying, his most petulant, and the plot of the film was also terrible. Lots of people still say they enjoy the climax of the film between Optimus, Sentinel, and Megatron, and while I do like Leonard Nimoy's character in the film, I admit he's not utilized particularly well, and that whole climactic battle kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth when you really think about it, but that's a story for another time. In the meantime, we're going to take a look at Dark of the Moon, the video game. Dark of the Moon, the game, was developed once again by High Moon Studios as a prequel to the film, taking place between the events of the second and third movies. The development time for this game was undeniably very short, most likely less than a year, and it probably started development the moment War for Cybertron hit store shelves. The idea of War for Cybertron with a different coat of paint sounds promising, but in spite of that, this game got poor reviews when it first released, and the general consensus from fans doesn't seem to be as celebrated when it comes to this game compared to the previous movie games. The first two games have a bit of a cult fan base. Lots of people got the video game based on the first movie when they were young, and it was a really fun tie-in to the movie. The game based on the second movie is genuinely an above-average and enjoyable title. What we have here with Dark of the Moon is a game that plays similarly to War for Cybertron, but is mechanically poorly balanced, has worse level design, next to nothing going on with the story, and is significantly shorter. But in spite of these shortcomings, it's still pretty decent and worth playing through at least once if you can find this game for cheap on the Xbox 360 or PS3. No PC port at all this time around. Not that it would be available anymore if it did. It's been tradition at this point that with the live-action movie video games, there has been the main console releases and then also the DS games, which are usually a pair of games for both the Autobots and Decepticons. And this is also true with Dark of the Moon. However, there is no PSP game this time around, and instead there is a third, even different game from the DS games made for the 3DS and the Wii called Dark of the Moon Stealth Edition. Now, I don't own any copies of those games, but I've gotten a lot of requests to cover the DS adaptations, and there's also the Transformers animated game released for the DS. And I do own a copy of that. Thank you once again to Caleb at Flashing Blades for helping me hook me up with that. But I've decided to finally bite the bullet and download a DS emulator to try to give some of these games a try. So far, I'm playing a little bit of the Decepticon game for the first movie. So far, I've got to say, it's actually quite impressive. It has really good 3D graphics for a DS game, and it has a lot of voice acting and more dialogue than even the console releases do. So at some point, I'm sure I'll follow up with a full video talking more about those DS games. Just give me some time to actually play them and gather my thoughts and gather some footage. It's easy to look at Dark of the Moon and assume it's simply a reskin of War for Cybertron. In a lot of ways, it is. But bizarrely, it's more of a weird intermediate stage between War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron, with some features that would be seen in the sequel introduced in this game. Some changes were made most likely to fit the setting of the Bay films better, but they have some interesting implications. So, for instance, in G1, the Transformers' weapons were little blaster guns they could pick up with their hands and use. In the Bayverse, almost every weapon is built into the characters. They transform their arms into guns they can use. War for Cybertron hybridized this idea by having the appearance of arms that transform into guns, but also wanting to pick up and drop off to weapon system of shooters at the time. This results in weapons being a diegetic element of the game world. In Dark of the Moon, to keep with the aesthetic and because it wouldn't make sense to be picking up Cybertronian weapons all over the ground on Earth, each character is locked with two specific weapons they start with for the entire mission, meaning there is less variety with weapon combinations in each stage, but with the additional trade-off of unlimited ammo. My gripe with the energon particles has been partially addressed as well, where you don't pick these up from the environment, you only really pick them up from enemies, and most abilities automatically cool down this time around. Also, health automatically regens, which means you don't have to worry about tracking down health pickups. The amusing thing about this is much of the challenge in War for Cybertron, or any game where you don't automatically heal from damage, is there are obstacles you want to avoid in order to not be at a significant disadvantage when you're at lower health later. However, there are times, for instance, like in the third mission where Starscream is dropping missiles on you on the road, where you can just afford to take the hits from some of his explosions and keep going because you'll just heal off the damage anyway, and as long as you don't die, that health bar is an expendable and infinite resource. Ultimately, these changes result in a significant skew in balance compared to the previous game, and the comparison between War for Cybertron and Dark of the Moon is a perfect microcosm of how certain standard shooter design elements can be argued for in favor or against. As a Transformers game, the way your alt mode is implemented is very important as well. One of the marketing points with this game, and with the toys at the time, was the Stealth Force weapons, where while in vehicle mode, the characters would pop out a few weapons to engage in combat while mobile. This works really well with how War for Cybertron implemented its vehicle modes. But Dark of the Moon has a lot of forced driving sequences where you have no choice but to be in your vehicle mode to drive long distances to reach a certain destination. There's a lot of this in the first and third missions right off the bat, and I shouldn't complain. Driving is cool, and these are Transformers. The alt modes are a critical part of the experience. However, driving sections like this need to have something for you to do. The Armada game and the first movie game let you use your alt mode mostly at your leisure to interact with the game's sandbox. But here, lots of the driving sections seem to be bare and empty with nothing in them, probably as a result of the very short dev time. For comparison as well, the James Bond 007 games usually always try to combine driving and combat. In the games Nightfire and Everything or Nothing, the driving sections are always action-packed and have lots of enemies to engage with while driving. From Russia with Love, for instance, has a more sandbox-style driving section. But I recently played the 7th gen Bond game Bloodstone and noticed that a lot of the driving sections felt empty, like all you were doing was chasing a target and not really doing much else, and I'm definitely reminded of that here. The driving sections just feel like empty stretches of map to get you to drive more, but they don't result in engaging gameplay. In terms of replayability, it reminds me a bit of the first movie game in a sense, because each mission only lets you play as one character and never lets you change weapons or abilities. But the first movie game at least had the advantage of being kind of a fun sandbox where you got to do extra content in the game world. This just ends up having little to no variety or replay value, no way to change up the experience on subsequent playthrough like Revenge of the Fallen or War for Cybertron would have. Ultimately, it's a bit mediocre, but let's go through each mission and see how they hold up. We get very little in terms of a story prologue. Just an opening voiceover by Peter Cullen saying that they're still hunting for the Decepticons 3 years after the events of Revenge of the Fallen. Bumblebee is being sent in to investigate whether or not the Autobots' transmissions are being intercepted by the Decepticons. We're told this facility we're going to is an abandoned Soviet Cold War satellite relay, which explains why we won't be seeing any human NPCs. In fact, I don't think we see any human NPCs throughout this entire game, unlike in the previous 2 movie games. Speaking of which, the models this time around for the Bayverse Transformers look better than ever. They've always been over-designed and over-detailed, so they've been very difficult to model in-game, and this is the best they've ever looked. After one of those long driving sequences, we get our first enemy encounter. Bumblebee's 2 weapons consist of a full-auto submachine gun, similar to Prime's Ion Blaster from War for Cybertron, and a projectile-based plasma cannon that's not at all like the charged plasma cannon from War for Cybertron, but it's pretty good. The hit scan weapon can make it easier to hit a lot of these airborne enemies we're going to be dealing with in this level, but the plasma cannon is just more fun to use and has pretty decent audio-visual feedback. As we chase the Decepticons, we're shown how to use our Stealth Force mode, which is the same standard way the vehicle combat worked in War for Cybertron. Bumblebee has some homing rockets, and they're pretty effective. His abilities include the ability to highlight enemies, which I suppose is useful, and a cool melee spin attack. They're better than a sharp stick in the eye, but you're not honestly going to use them all that often. The main section of this level is a battle in the abandoned town, where we're going to have to upload a virus into a bunch of Decepticon signal transmitters while waiting for Prime and Sideswipe to arrive. Once they do, it's a large standoff against a ton of generic Decepticon grunts until the mission ends. It's here I'd like to point out that the original score for this game is actually quite excellent.
Jeff Broadbent does a very good job matching the source material and making a score that is familiar to what Steve Jablonsky did for the films and the Revenge of the Fallen game. The opening cutscene for the second mission establishes that the Autobots turned the tables on the whole transmission stealing thing and have revealed the location of Decepticons all around the world, justifying Prime's earlier concern. Wait, is that a live actor? Is this an FMV game from the 90s now? What is going on? Oh, and in spite of my earlier compliments about the game's models being really well done, this live actor does not mesh well next to these portraits. Anyway, the Decepticons have started attacking Detroit, and while the military is engaged in civilian evacuation, Ratchet and Ironhide are sent in to help out. Apparently, the working conditions and costs of living are so bad in Detroit, even the auto industry itself is revolting. Ironhide, although slow, is pretty fun to play as. He has a pretty overpowered set of weapons, and since they have unlimited ammo, he's definitely not balanced at all. He has an autocannon with a slow rate of fire but high damage, and a shotgun that is much more effective at long range than it has any right to be. His abilities consist of the Heavy Iron, which is literally one of the turrets from War for Cybertron permanently attached to him but on a cooldown, and a shoulder-mounted grenade launcher that is just the homing mines repurposed from War for Cybertron as well. All of that praise aside, most of this level is essentially just corridor shooting without much interesting going on in the level at all. There's not much in the way of elevation or anything dynamic going on with the environment. It's just walking down city streets, mowing down every enemy that comes in your way. At some point, the Heavy Iron gets upgraded into the neutron cannon turret things in War for Cybertron and is a bit more powerful. It's the only way to damage Mixmaster, the boss of this stage, as he starts out with 4 arm shields that are impossible to damage with anything else. He's a decent enough boss fight without anything really to write home about in terms of design. You can basically take one look at him and know exactly how the fight is going to play out. In the third mission, we control Mirage, as he's gone in search of Sideswipe, who's gone missing during his mission. Mirage is referred to as Dino in the movie. I really don't know what that was all about, but a cool red Autobot with arm blades that transforms into a Ferrari definitely appeals to my inner child.
All right, Mirage, it's just you and me for one.
No, it's just me.
Is he quoting Megatron from the first movie? Also, Mirage is kind of a dick here to our human ally for no reason. I guess he just has too much of that 90s attitude. As I said before, I'm not really fond of this driving section of this level, and I don't think it's particularly well designed. Mirage does come equipped with the game's sniper rifle, though, which gets the job done and behaves pretty much the same as it does in War for Cybertron. What follows is a section that at least offers some varied gameplay on what we've seen before. Mirage takes a rocket from Starscream and falls into a ravine with his weapon systems now offline. Now we have the first required stealth section of the series so far. It's pretty easy, and your cloak allows you to walk at full speed and be completely undetectable, unlike the cloaking systems in certain Halo games where the faster you walk, the less effective the cloaking is. There's a section here where you have to time your cloak cooldown by hiding in cover and slowly take out one enemy at a time, which can be challenging with some of these heavy gunner type enemies. Lots of people can be really snobby when it comes to stealth sections in games for either being not realistic or they're overly critical of how alert or not alert enemies behave. But for a section tacked onto a game that's otherwise not about stealth, they did a good job here. It's fun and inoffensive, and the game moves on to something else afterwards. We meet up with Bumblebee, and he tells us that Sideswipe's last signal pinged at this ancient temple-looking place. So we go down there and just completely unprompted interact with this weird Cybertronian cube thing in the center, and the whole temple goes haywire. And we have a mini-boss against an Enforcer-type enemy. Why didn't we touch that cube? What did we think was going to happen? Anyway, the Enforcer is a little tricky to deal with because the only close to medium-range weapon we have is this SMG, which isn't very effective. Next is a section of more corridor shooting with some frankly shockingly limited boundaries and some really low-to-the-ground invisible walls you can't climb over. It's a semi-escort mission where you have to give Bumblebee sniper fire support until it culminates in a boss fight against Starscream. This game doesn't have 2 separate campaigns for the Autobots and Decepticons. Instead, you switch perspectives throughout the campaign to better accommodate a variety of characters and suit the plot. So in Mission 4, we swap over to the Decepticons and play as Soundwave. Soundwave here in this game has an alternate alt mode not seen in the movie. Before he adapts his Mercedes SL alt mode from the film, he has this weird SUV looking thing. We're intercepting Autobot communications with Nest in hopes of gathering more intel. Soundwave is hands down the most powerful and fun to play as character we've had yet. He has an automatic machine gun, which is decent enough, but his standout weapon that will probably be spamming
is his sonic cannon, which is like if you took the charged plasma cannon from War for Cybertron and actually made it good. If the visual and sound design of the Bayverse film specifically appeals to you, playing as Soundwave here I feel like really captures the vibe extremely well, even if his transformation animation is literally the same animation pull from War for Cybertron. After we find the hidden volcano-adjacent Autobot nest base, I'm sorry, the what? Like, I know the Bayverse movies are over the top and stupid, but in those movies, Nest and the Autobots would likely be on like a military base or something. This is the first thing I've seen so far in this game that genuinely feels like it came straight out of the 80s cartoon. Sorry, I got distracted there. When we find it, we send in Laserbeak to infiltrate, and for some reason they decided we needed to play as him in the process. To say his flight controls are jank is definitely underselling it. It's pretty awkward to control, especially in tight spaces. But credit where it's due, it once again introduces some varied gameplay where Laserbeak can disguise himself as objects in the environment and ambush enemies with a stun attack. It's pretty neat, but not as mandatory as you would think. After Laserbeak sabotages the base defenses, Soundwave infiltrates and is able to start blowing stuff up. In spite of the fact that I don't really enjoy the Laserbeak section, the Soundwave sections of this level probably make it my favorite mission in the game. We have to systematically destroy the base from within and narrowly escape the volcano in order to get out. Once again, just flawless base placement on behalf of the Autobots here. Just wonderful decision on their part. Mission 5 is pretty short but quite memorable. We take control of Starscream and right away we're locked in a fight with Air Raid and his forces. After blowing through a few waves of enemies, Air Raid takes off and we have to chase him through a canyon. I have absolutely no clue why they had to jankify the flight controls in this game. It couldn't have been for realism because this is a real-life jet. Just copy the exact same vehicle physics from War for Cybertron and everything would have been fine. We catch up to the aerial bots and now we have to deal with an airborne boss fight against Stratosphere. I guess that oversized rust bucket from Rise of the Beast appeared somewhere else in the Bayverse canon beforehand. This is a pretty cool set piece. Starscream has to use his rockets to destroy Stratosphere's defense turrets, and then we can land on him and take off the other Autobots defending him. Rip open the hatch on his back and we can finally deal some permanent damage. This goes on for a while, but the later phases get a lot more aggressive with his defenses, shooting huge barrages of missiles at you. Starscream's ability is a huge guided missile that deals a ton of damage. After enough persistence, Stratosphere starts plummeting out of the sky, and we have to retrieve his cargo. While Soundwave is working on de-thawing and reviving Shockwave, Starscream returns to base and meets with Megatron. Starscream's intent was to steal the mech-tech equipment that Stratosphere was carrying so they could reverse-engineer it. Of course, this does not go as planned, and as it turns out the Autobots can track each of their mech-tech devices, leading them straight to Megatron's base. Mech-tech was a weapon gimmick that the toy line was using for Dark of the Moon, and I shouldn't be surprised that it's carried over into the game as well. You finally get to play as Megatron here, and he initially starts out without his weapons or his alt mode. You kill a few Autobots with your melee attack and your drain ability before your weapons come online. He has the same automatic rifle that Soundwave does in addition to his signature fusion cannon. After taking a nasty hit from a rocket, Megatron finds himself separated from the rest of the Decepticons defending the base. He goes in search of, and I kid you not, some plutonium in order to feed these little Cybertronian spider creature hatchlings. This will be one of his abilities for the rest of the level, where you can spawn these little hatchlings and they'll eat away at certain machinery that's in your way. The rest of the level is just more combat and basic puzzle solving with the hatchlings, until we finally get Megatron's new alt mode, at which point he finally adopts his new Dark of the Moon design. Now we have some long corridors to drive down and we can finally use all of our weapons and abilities as needed. This mission culminates in a super cool boss fight against Warpath, the only time he appears in the Bayverse. He has an honestly awesome and memorable design, but there's not much in the way of strategy to this fight. Right when we're about to finish the process of de-thawing Shockwave, none other than Optimus Prime himself shows up to stop us, equipped with some pretty cool mech-tech weapons. This results in a fight where we have to destroy these coolant canisters as he passes in front of them to give us an opportunity to break through his shields. If we manage to beat Prime, we toss him into a chamber where Shockwave and his weird giant robot worm thing resides, resulting in Mission 7, which is entirely a boss fight against Shockwave and his worm, and is the only time in the game we get to play as Prime. And guess what? This is the final mission in the game. After we beat Shockwave, the game just suddenly ends. That's it? Wow, that was short.
This was my first ever blind playthrough, and my total runtime for the entire playthrough, including deaths and resets, was 4 hours and 25 minutes. I can't say that I'm disappointed by it. I had a good time playing it and a good time covering it, but needless to say, it's probably my least favorite of all of the movie tie-in games, and I think that opinion is largely shared with a lot of people. I know this has got to sound cliche at this point, but it really does feel unfinished. Like there could have been at least another 3 levels to round out the game to the same level count that War for Cybertron had, but War for Cybertron didn't have the disadvantage of having to meet the deadline for a movie release. If you can find this game in the wild for cheap, I would recommend picking it up if you are a Transformers fan, because it does have solid gameplay and presentation, and if you can find it for, under $10, you're still getting your money's worth out of it. It is worth a playthrough even if it is really short. So what's next from here? Well, I guess I have a lot of emulated DS games I've got to play now. Also, I have the Wii rail shooter version of War for Cybertron I've got to play. Yes, this copy is still sealed. So, considering I've never played that, it'll probably take me some time to gather my thoughts on it, as well as the Transformers Prime Wii game I've never played. So, for the next video, we're going to be covering a game that is going to be very, very special. Till next time.